We are talking about vector-borne illness and tic disorders. Okay, we're going to talk about it in two different ways, I guess I'll say, is that you have the way that the CDC looks at vector-borne illnesses, and you have the way that ILADS looks at vector-borne illnesses. So ILADS is the International Lyme and Associated Disease Society. And this is where I really put my focus, more on what ILADS is saying. Why? Because ILADS, the International Lyme and Associated Disease Society, is a group of providers and practitioners who are looking at the clinical data and less about what the numbers from the CDC say. So I will break this down a little bit more, but we are going to talk about really this alternative approach to Lyme and any kind of vector-borne illnesses. So let's talk a little bit about what a vector-borne illness is, and then we're going to talk about how it can impact your child's symptoms, their tics, this kind of thing. So vector-borne illnesses are infections that are transmitted to humans through a bite of infected insects or arthropods, such as mosquitoes, ticks, fleas. Example of vector-borne illnesses include Lyme disease, West Nile, and Zika virus. So this is what we're talking about, these vector-borne illnesses. Illnesses come from being bitten by an infected insect. Fine, we have horrible mosquitoes where I live, so not a super fan of insects that bite me. All right. So we need to look at it in this aspect. Let's break down what PANS and PANDAS is and how it can be impacted by these vector-borne illnesses. I talk about PANS and PANDAS more in depth in the book in chapter 3. So if you have the book or you want to order the book, you can read about that a little bit more in depth. In short, PANS is pediatric acute onset neuropsychiatric syndrome, and PANDAS is pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorder associated with streptococcal infection. So with PANDAS, we know that cause is from strep. However, is it from strep alone? I'm going to say no, because I think we do so much stuff to damage our immune system that, yes, we get this overabundance of strep, and then we have these PANDAS-like symptoms. PANS, on the other hand, is a condition that is believed to be triggered by infections or other environmental factors. It can be, from foods you're eating, infections you may have, gut pathogens, leaky gut. There's so many things that can lead to this PANS diagnosis, if you can get a diagnosis. I feel like probably most of the kids I work with, probably if they were going to go down this route, probably have a PANS diagnosis. I am not giving anybody a diagnosis. I don't care what label you have. Our goal is to look at what is going on underneath the surface, what's happening underneath the hood. Getting a PANS or PANDAS diagnosis, in my opinion, is, you might get somebody to give you a prescription if you have a PANS or PANDAS diagnosis, but I don't think it's the most significant thing. So you have to understand PANDAS caused by strep, PANS caused by so many other multiple triggers. And no one's really sure what might be the cause of PANDAS. I totally think my son had PANS. Had that been a diagnosis 11 years ago, it was not. Because I can look at all his symptoms and say, well, this is all related to this, inflammation and this dysregulated immune system. So although PANS and PANDAS are not considered vector-borne illnesses, there is evidence that suggests that certain infections, like strep, may trigger these conditions. So we know that in some cases, the immune response to an infection can result in this overabundance of antibodies that attack your child's own tissues. It happens to adults who struggle with autoimmune issues. If you have an autoimmune disease, your body, in layman's terms, we're just going to put it this way, may attack your own tissues. That's not technically correct, but for layman, we're going to lay it out that way. And so we can see this really leading to those symptoms associated with PANS and PANDAS. So the tics, the OCD, the mood swings, I see a lot of clients who struggle with anxiety and separation anxiety and these kinds of things. These are the typical kind of PANS, PANDAS symptoms. The mood swings, the tics, the separation anxiety, all of these are really kind of relatable to that. So some studies suggest that vector-borne illnesses like Lyme disease can trigger PANS and PANDAS in some children. So for example, somebody who contracts the Lyme disease, they get bit by a tick and develops antibodies that cross-react with the proteins in the brain, can lead to these neuropsychiatric symptoms. Overall, though, the link between vector-borne illness and PANS and PANDAS people are going to say it's not really understood. However, those of us that are working in the field and are looking at the clinical data, we are seeing that yes, these underlying infections, whether it's Lyme or Bartonella, we're going to dig into those a little bit more, can trigger, strep can trigger these symptoms. So we know that Lyme disease is a tick-borne illness caused by the bacterium, I cannot speak today, Borrelia burgdorferi. There are different strains of Borrelia. They are not all burgdorferi, but that Borrelia burgdorferi is really coming from that area in Connecticut where we're looking at that particular form of Lyme. However, there are a lot of common co-infections when it comes to Lyme disease. So when we are looking at you get bit by a tick, the CDC says that you have to get bit by a tick and it has to be attached for 48 hours in order to transmit Lyme disease. And then you're gonna get a red bullseye-like rash. This is what the CDC says. When we start to look at what ILADS is saying, this alternative criteria, we know that there's people who've been bitten by a tick who don't get the rash, and we know there's people who have been bitten by a tick who have all of the Lyme symptoms, all of the co-infection symptoms, but maybe that tick was not attached for 48 hours. And so it's really important to step away from how the CDC views a diagnosis for Lyme disease and really start to look at, have you been bitten by a tick? Or maybe you as the parent were bitten by the tick and your child has all these symptoms, because we do know there is some data that it can be passed in utero. So we have to look at okay, are you experiencing these symptoms? Maybe this is something that we need to test because you are experiencing these symptoms, especially if you're living somewhere that has a lot of ticks and you may be exposed to getting Lyme disease. Where I live, we have a lot less Lyme disease. We still have some ticks and fleas and things like that, but in the middle of the desert, we have a lot less Lyme disease than those of you who are living in areas in the east, because that's really where a lot of the Lyme disease originates. So yes, you can get Lyme disease, but what we see is that it's not Lyme disease alone. It is Lyme disease with co-infections. Yes, you can get co-infections and not have Lyme disease. So this is why when I look at a Lyme disease test, I'm going to test Lyme and the co-infections. Most providers are just simply going to look at Lyme, and I'm like, no, you have to look at the co-infections, because your immune system gets so bogged down that these co-infections can really start to run rampant. So some of these co-infections include things like babesiosis. This is a parasitic infection that attacks the red blood cells, resulting in fever and chills. We have anaplasmosis. This is a bacterial infection that affects white blood cells and causes flu-like symptoms, a fever, headache, muscle aches, fatigue. You have ehrlichiosis. It's also a bacterial infection looking at chills, fever, headache, muscle aches, gastrointestinal symptoms. Bartonella is another big co-infection. Usually it's Lyme and Bartonella that really go together. It is a bacterial infection as well that can cause fever, fatigue, swollen lymph nodes. Things like mycoplasma. Mycoplasma is a bacterial infection. It is one of the smallest bacteria on the planet. It can cause respiratory and neurological symptoms. And then we also look at other co-infections like Powassin or HPV. So Powassin is a viral infection, HPV being a viral infection. So we're really looking at a whole slew of these vector-borne illnesses. So the Lyme plus all of the co-infections. It's really essential to look at all of these things together in order to reassure somebody that they are going to have a really good recovery, because we know what's going on under the hood. And we know that co-infections can complicate Lyme disease, and we can lead to more severe symptoms if left untreated. So you guys have heard me talk about tic disorders really stemming from this imbalanced immune system. So let's say that for you, your trigger for imbalanced immune system is maybe you do have this underlying vector-borne illness, and maybe you have some of these co-infections. So let's say you have Lyme plus babesiosis and Bartonella. You have to address all of those things, but you also have to look at what other things might be bogging down your immune system. Do you have mold toxicity? Is there environmental toxins? Is there food sensitivity? Is there leaky gut? What else in that process is going to hinder you from really recovering from that Lyme? So this is where you can't just look at one test alone. And I tell parents this, there's not just one standalone test that you can do and it's going to be like, you have to look at multiple factors. And so no, Lyme disease is not one of the things that I test right out of the gate. Why? Because it's really, really pricey. But there are a lot of clients that I work with that maybe we get down the road and we're like, yes, we really think you need this additional testing. So I do think vector-borne illnesses, so things like Lyme and the co-infections can be a driver of these PANS, PANDAS, tic disorder symptoms. Absolutely. I see it. I work with a lot of clients who are struggling with Lyme and co-infections. And there's several several schools of thought that go along with the Lyme disease piece. And that is, you have the conventional CDC that's like, when you get a CDC diagnosis of Lyme, you have to have all these, they're called bands. You have to have all of these different bands at all of these different levels in order to get a positive. Then that approach is going to be usually long-term prophylactic antibiotics. Okay, so there's the CDC. Then you have more of this natural ILADS approach that says, okay, you maybe not have all the bands based on the CDC, but when we look at the alternative criteria, you definitely have this abundance of Lyme and co-infections. So at that point, we can look at, well, they can do a combination. If you have a provider who's going to provide you antibiotics, you can do a combination of antibiotics and natural approach. Or you can do natural approach. You have to consider that antibiotics, yes, on some level are going to be beneficial for the underlying infections. However, they may drive some issues with the gut because antibiotics can be like an atomic bomb for the gut. So you have to look at what are the best options for you? Like, if this is going on, what steps are you going to take and what kind of provider are you going to work with? I definitely recommend doing something with an ILADS literate provider. I am a certified Lyme's practitioner and I look at it from the clinical ILAD perspective. We're looking at it for, hey, you've got the symptoms, you've got some of these things popping on the test results. What can we do about that? So we know that the typical way that we're looking at Lyme is that you get infected by a bite from a black-legged tick, and then you get the fever, you get the bullseye rash. But just know, like I said previously when we're looking at this, that ILADS looks at the clinical piece and not necessarily like, oh my gosh, you had the rash and the fever. Because you can get the Lyme, you can get the co-infections, maybe you don't ever see that rash or fever. Maybe that's not what pops up for you. So one of the ways that Lyme can lower your immune system is by causing this chronic inflammation. I want everyone to understand when I'm talking about these studies and the chronic inflammation and the things that we're looking at and when it comes to tic disorders is there are so many drivers of inflammation and it is not just one. And when you get a dysregulated immune system, these kids are so sensitive that I like to say someone farts in the wrong direction, it is going to spur their symptoms. Why? Because they are so ultra sensitive because their immune system is like red alert. Okay. So one of the ways that it really can lower your immune system is by causing that chronic inflammation. When your body is infected with the Borrelia burgdorferi, the immune system mounts a response. You have this underlying infection. Your immune system's like, okay, man, gotta go to work. We have to fight off that infection, which can result in inflammation. So that chronic inflammation continues to suppress the immune system, making it more difficult to fight off other infections. Enter the co-infections, right? You're having all this inflammation, you have a hard time fighting off these infections. Hello, co-infections, they're gonna just mosey right on in there. So Lyme can also cause elevated production of antibodies. Antibodies are those proteins produced by the immune system that help identify and neutralize those foreign invaders, such as bacteria and viruses, hello, Lyme and co-infections. People with Lyme, a lot of times that production of those antibodies can be impaired, which makes it easier, again, for those other infections to take hold. Additionally, Lyme disease can affect how your white blood cells function, which are that essential component for your immune system. They are responsible for, again, identifying and destroying those foreign invaders. But we really want to know what are those drivers for inflammation. And when we test, when we look at that information, that test data, we are able to really start to discern what is driving that inflammatory response in your body. Is it just vector-borne illness alone? Is it Lyme and co-infections? Is it food sensitivity? Is it stress in the form of environmental, physical, mental, emotional. Like, what are these forms of stressors? You guys hear me talk all the time about the 4 triggers. So we look at environmental, biological, mental, and physical, or emotional in the mental piece. But we have to look at what is driving those factors. And we can look at paper. Paper's great. We have some great data and some great test results. This is why we test. But it's not always completely clear unless you are really comparing and contrasting what those people are experiencing as far as symptoms, how long they've been experiencing them, all of the things that are going on in their diet and lifestyle. That's how holistic works. You have to take into consideration everything in your environment around you, where you're living, what you're doing, what you're eating, what's going on inside your body. It is a holistic approach. It is not woo-woo. There's science, there's data there, but we have to look at the body as a whole. So yes, in short, Lyme and co-infections, vector-borne illnesses from ticks, mosquitoes, bugs, bugs that are going to bite you, can be a driver of that dysregulated immune system. So yes, definitely, that vector-borne illness can definitely be an issue for people. Is it an issue for everybody I work with? Absolutely not. There are so many people who there's not a hint or a trace of Lyme, but they're experiencing so many other drivers of that dysregulated immune system. Is that helpful? Does everybody now have a better understanding of Lyme, co-infections, and vector-borne illnesses? Yes, it is an underlying infection. Underlying infections, whether it's a vector-borne illness or not, can dysregulate your immune system. And just know, when you're looking at Lyme, there are 2 criteria. You have CDC and you have ILADS. ILADS is looking at that clinical data from people who are in the field working with clients, and we're really considering your symptoms in that aspect instead of just seeing what the stupid paper says.